Here is a PhD student from Miami University who is also studying birds, Dhruv Iyengar, they're probably pronounced differently. But he has been studying a variety of different things at Miami University, from local avian ecology, avian malaria, and some molt patterns as well. He is also a social media and research officer for the Avian Research and Education Institute. We brought some brochures here if you guys are interested in learning more about that institute as well. And we'll welcome him for his presentation. Made that bird.
Well, thank you all for being here. I want to preface this by saying I've been told I have audiobook voice, so I won't blame you if you fall asleep, but try not to. But welcome to this talk. Before I go ahead, I want to introduce myself. My name is Dhruv. I am a PhD student at Miami, like Lisa said. I study a variety of things, but I'm also an officer of AREI, Avian Research and Education Institute, is a nonprofit in southwestern Ohio. We work mostly out of Oxford, where Miami's based, but we've been known to branch out. And I'm also a NABC, North American Banding Council certified bird bander, and that's largely what the focus of my research surrounds, is bird banding. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But before we get into that, I have a few questions for you guys to ponder and chew on as I talk. Has anyone seen red knots? Is anyone familiar with red knots? Okay, that's a red knot. They're shorebird. They go up and down the Atlantic coast. They travel far distances. But they look like that. They're nice bright red shorebird. They're pretty charismatic. But what's this? Not this. That's a willow. Right. What's that? No.
I thought it was a killdeer.
Shorebird birding is hard. Don't play that. That is also a red knot. Okay. What made the difference between these two? Why are they different? Sex. Well, red knots look the same sex-wise. What else? They don't have different breeding privileges, but time of year, closer.
Juvenile versus old?
Exactly. Juvenile versus young versus old, right? Now, if you're out at the beach and you see 100 of these guys, 2 of these, does that make a difference? If you see 500 of these guys, not him, and 2 of these, does that make a difference? Chew on that.
Yeah.
Bird we catch a lot when we work is Swainson's thrush. Okay? You might see them this time of year. You go out looking, they're migrating through now. This is an example. We use what's called Modus technology to track them. It's basically a little tracker that hits off of cell towers all across the Western Hemisphere. And this is an example path that's actually at our station. It's one of the ones we've tagged. And they go from the north to the south and back again, year after year. One of the things I'm studying is avian malaria. Now, we as a banding station, like many other banding stations in the US, have access to our local population. We see Swainson's thrushes when they move through, not when they're breeding and not when they're down here. So we only get a glimpse into their lives. Now, if a Swainson's thrush, brand new, hatched this year, has malaria, where did it get it from?
Mom and dad.
Well, it very likely got it from here because it's never been down south, right? And we're not in either place. We're only here when we catch it in passing, right? So we can use that to make an inference about what ecological community it's interacting with, right? And similarly, if we're catching them in the spring when they're moving from the south to the north, we can make different inferences about where they might be getting it from. Right? Chew on that a little bit as I move through. This is not a bird that you're going to see around here, although I wish it was. This is a white-necked jacobin, and it's a hummingbird. And they're really, really cool because they do what's called female camouflage. So males are extremely aggressive. And so females, to avoid harassment from territorial males, they actually have evolved to look like male plumage from a young age. And then only later in life do they acquire their female-like plumage, or acquire their different plumage. And you can see here, here's an older female, nice and green and white. Here's a young female just kind of losing its little blue from its face. But when they're young, right, they've got blue light, that's a nice adult male. That's a nice something, it's a young bird. Do we know whether it's male or female? Do we know if it's going to grow up into being a territorial male defending its supply of food or defending its range? Or is it going to be a female that's actually hiding from males? How do we answer these questions? The answer, like I alluded to, is bird banding. We bird band. So we actually catch these birds and we band them. And the benefit of that is not only do we get to see what birds are in what locations at what time, but it also allows us to look at very individual characters of the birds we handle. In simple explanation, what we do is we put a little metal ring on the bird with a unique identifying number that sets that bird apart from any other bird that it could be. So we collect data, like physiological data and health data, and that gets attached to that band number, and every time that bird is recaptured, we re-log in that data and we can track that bird over time. Additionally, if a bird flies somewhere else, as they tend to do, it might surprise you, it can be caught by someone else, and now we know where the bird has gone at a different point in time. And it creates this really cool network of data that we can access. And it tells us a lot about birds and where they're going, and more importantly, how they live their lives, how their life cycle progresses, right? And as a bander, all of us banders are a little weird to begin with, but has anyone heard of the Tetris effect? Has anyone played Tetris? If you played any like phone game or chess or something for long periods of time, you close your eyes and you see it in your head, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? I do that with feathers. We've looked at feathers so much that I close my eyes and I see feathers, and it's bad. But first, what are feathers, right? We talk about them, we've seen them. You've probably seen birds with feathers, probably seen feathers lying on the ground, but what are they, right? Birds are what dinosaurs became. That is, I think, one of the coolest facts ever, because it's dinosaurs. And so birds evolved from dinosaurs, and dinosaurs were reptiles. And reptiles have this evolutionary trait, which we call scales today. And feathers are just modified versions of scales. So just like reptiles shed their scales, birds shed their feathers, they molt, they go through ecdysis. That's ugly cardinal. But we actually have fossil evidence of feathers dating back, hundreds of millions of years, down to Archaeopteryx, right? Archaeopteryx is this evolutionary ancestor of birds. It's actually a separate lineage, but it's evidence that reptilian-like creatures were evolving into birds, and they were evolving feathers as they went through that. And one of the coolest things, I love talking about this, is that T-Rex and Velociraptor very well could have had feathers in your classic Jurassic Park dinosaurs. There's evidence that relatives of them did, but I won't ramble about dinosaurs. All this to say, feathers are this ancient structure that have evolved over time, and they've evolved into something really, really complex. And we break them down into anatomy, right? Feathers have a fractal-like structure. It means as you get smaller and smaller, they're made up of repeating parts. So you start with your feather vein, we call that your feather shaft, we call that the rachis. The feather shaft has veins. Each vein has barbs. Each barbs have barbules. Each barbules have hooklets, and they all zip in together. right? If you've ever played with a feather, you go one way, it unzips, but then go the other way, it zips right back up, right? That's because of this complex interlocking structure that they've developed. Feathers also grow just like hair, right? They grow from inside the follicle, the cell that grows the feather, and they go outwards. And contrary to popular belief, maybe, birds aren't actually covered in feathers. They have specific tracts on their body that grow those feathers, and then other tracts are bare. And different parts of the body grow feathers differently, and so we name them different things. So the wing feathers are different than the tail feathers, are different than the body feathers, and they're actually different feather types. So you have these large feathers, right, the big old school quills. Those are your flight feathers. You also have tail feathers. Those are responsible largely for catching air, structural support, right? And these plume-like feathers are for coloration, insulation, etc., etc. Yeah, rictal bristles, not rectal bristles. That's not a thing. Rictal bristles are kind of like safety goggles for birds flying in the air, and they stop insect parts from flashing in their eyes. But all this is why are feathers important, right? Why do birds spend so much time on their feathers? Why do we spend so much time worrying about their feathers? What's the big deal? Now, birds spend the vast majority of their lives doing largely three things. They breed, right? All life makes more of itself. They spend huge amounts of time taking care of breeding and breeding condition. They migrate and they spend time non-breeding or wintering. So our Swainson's thrush again breeds all the way up here, but then spends time down here not breeding. It's just surviving until the next season where it can go back to breeding, and that's a big part of their lives as well. But another huge part of their life is molting. Molting is, like I said, shedding of feathers. They replace their feathers. This is a penguin. Penguins are known to do what's called catastrophic molts. That's why this guy's just exploding in feathers. But they spend large amounts of time, but mostly large amounts of energy replacing their feathers. Why is this the case? And the reason is, it's important to think of feathers as organs, or rather plumage as a whole as an organ. It's controlled by neurological and endocrine or hormonal drivers, and this is because they provide a variety of functions to the bird. One of the big ones is thermal regulation. Just like fur in mammals, this keeps birds warm. Birds are warm-blooded, so they use that insulation to keep themselves warm in cold conditions. This might not seem like it's thermal regulating, but in Africa it's cold, guys. So this is a nice winter jacket for him. They also use it for display and communication. This can be for attracting mates, these bright colors, or it can be for driving off competitors, or both, but also for showing how immunologically healthy they can be. A variety of other reasons for displaying and communication to other birds. Also for camouflage. Does anyone look for a bittern in here ever? Has anyone seen a bittern? It's tough. This is the least bittern. They look exactly like the stalks of grass they live in, and that's for good reason. They don't want to get hunted out of the sky, right? But they want to feed, and they don't want their prey to see them either. And unfortunately for us, that means we can't see them either. But bitterns, camouflage, that means they need their feathers to look nice and exactly as designed so that they can live their lives. Common pintos are known as stick birds. They're in South America. They do the same thing. Right? You walk up on a tree, and this is a nice picture showing where it is, but in real life, the tree's right there, and you can just completely miss it. So they rely on camouflage. They also rely on barrier against water, right? Ducks, eider down, right? These are nice insulated coats. But eiders, sea ducks, ducks, flamingos, all birds that spend time in water need a barrier against water. Because water can be harsh, it can be cold, it can really affect the body in many ways. So they need that organ protecting them. This is my absolute favorite bird, because this bird uses its feathers for something entirely amazing. And what it does, I wish I could play this out, but what it does is it has these feathers almost like violin bows, right? In the same way a violin bow uses friction to make sound, this bird beats its wings against its body to make sound. And that's a display, that's a mating display for females. So it needs those feathers to be very, very well taken care of. This bird is one of, I believe, 2 poisonous species of birds on the planet, and the poison is actually deposited in the feathers. And that's what this bird uses its plumage organ for. Woodpeckers, you guys have all seen woodpeckers, right? They cock themselves up on a tree. That's using their tail for structural support. Birds incorporate feathers into nests. And, again, it might surprise you, they fly. What's wrong with this picture?
There's no feathers.
That's a fact.
They're not birds, but they can fly, I think. I think that one's fine. One of the really cool things I love about birds is that feathered flight is, as of right now, only known to have been evolved once. Because each feather is so complex, and to get a feathered wing has taken so much evolutionary time. Membranous wings, membranous flight have evolved multiple times. But it was one lineage of dinosaurs that decided to do this and cause problems for us all, and fly. But birds fly, birds move by flying. It's a very, very unique way of movement because it opens a third dimension, right? It's not just walking up, forward, back, left, right, but you can move. You avoid predators, you can migrate, you can do all sorts of things. And feathers allow them to do that. So, feathers are so cool, and they're so well regulated, and they're so important to a bird. They are well maintained enough that they help us identify birds down to the individual. And what this means is we use them to identify age and sex. Not just what the bird is, but how old it is and what sex it is. And that informs a variety of different things. Like I said, birds molt. And this is an example of it. These birds are shedding their feathers. Their feathers are going from their ratty and old and worn feathers into their new feathers. It's like getting a fresh coat of paint every year. And there's a few ways we classify that. Birds do their molting at least once a year, right? So they leave the nest and they grow in this juvenile plumage of feathers. And in the case of these birds, we call these simple basic birds, where they molt once a year, and then they molt the next year. Then they molt once the next year. And then they do that until they die. But it gets more complicated than that. Some birds have what we call a breeding plumage, or an alternate plumage. So they don't just molt once a year, these birds molt twice a year. So they molt once out of the nest, and then they do their first pre-alternate molt. That's their first breeding season. And then they go into their second pre-basic plumage, that's their normal plumage. About 6 months later, and then 6 months later, they go through their second alternate molt, their second breeding season, then their third basic, back 6 months again, and so they cycle on a slightly shorter time interval. The most common, the ones we see with our common birds, is our complex basic strategy. And this is, they have their juvenile plumage out of the nest, but then in between their first basic plumage, their juvenile plumage, and their second basic plumage, they have inserted molt called a formative plumage. And the reason this evolved, this is actually thought to have evolved first. All birds probably had this, and then they evolved into the other two, is because all birds started out probably small. They're probably small reptilian, lizard-like dinosaurs. And so when they got their flighted juvenile plumage, they needed to evolve a kind of fast-tracked adult plumage to get out of the nest and avoid predators quickly. And then once they survived that, they would evolve, or they would molt into their next basic plumage, their next adult plumage. And then the most complicated of all is everything all at once. These birds do everything. So they have their juvenile plumage, and then they have their inserted formative molt, and then they do their first breeding season, and then they go back to their adult plumage, and then adult breeding season, and then they cycle through that for the rest of their lives. Now, like I said, feather molt, feather maintenance is heavily controlled by neurological cues and endocrinological cues or hormonal cues. It's the bird's physiology telling the feathers what to do. But sometimes birds lose feathers just because they beat their wing on something, or if they're caught by us and we need to collect DNA samples, we pluck their feathers and need to grow them back out. That's not considered molt. That's considered adventitious molt. That's just happening on accident. Also, birds have evolved to have very loosely attached tail feathers, so that way if a predator, like this dog, catches it, it can just shed its feathers or let it go and fly away. It's not as much of an active process, but if a predator catches it, it's not going to yank the whole bird. The feathers will just dissipate. And then in that case, as the feathers grow back, that's also not active molt because that was externally stimulated. So when birds come out of the nest, they do what's called simultaneous growth, which means all their feathers grow in at once. And you can see this if you've ever seen nestling or if you've ever seen pictures of it. All of these feathers are growing in. This is evidence of growing feathers. It's called a pin. They grow into this waxy sheath, and then that sheath sheds when the feather matures. And so because they're growing in all at once, every feather only gets so much energy because the bird's doing it at the same time. It doesn't get to allocate that energy efficiently, so all the feathers are kind of a cheap thread-like quality, and we'll get to why that's important in a second. When they get into their adult stages, when they start molting their flight feathers, they do it sequentially. So they'll do their body molt, but then they'll molt their flight feathers one at a time, so as they can go and forage and feed, they can allot energy more or less equally to each feather. And so sometimes in that formative plumage, right, sometimes that formative plumage is not complete. It doesn't include all the feathers. It leaves behind juvenile feathers. So you have these fresh, formative, adult-like feathers contrasting with juvenile feathers. And that's what we call a molt limit. Once again, this occurs only when the molt is finished, only when the bird stops molting. If the bird was actively molting, for example, and we saw a difference, it's not a molt limit. But this is one of the ways we can identify a young bird or an old bird. In fact, this is very similar to what a Swainson's thrush would do. So if we caught a Swainson's thrush now, we might see a molt limit between different feather tracts and identify it as young. When it does its adult definitive molt, it's going to do everything. It's not going to leave any contrast. So if we see a bird with no contrast, it's probably an older bird. And so, like I was saying, those juvenile feathers come in all at once, and they get very little energy each. So they grow in kind of poor quality, kind of threadbare, right? So they don't get to lay down their proteins as efficiently, so they're nice and spaced out, versus adult feathers grow in one at a time, and each feather gets a good amount of energy as it's growing, so they grow in much more detailed. And shape matters as well because juvenile feathers don't have as much proteins in them. Their shape is much thinner, they're tinier feathers, and adult feathers are nice and big, nice and they have nice volume to them. Younger feathers also grow all at the same time, so they have growth bars, and this is different stages of development based on night and day cycles. So you have lighter portions that grow during the day and darker portions that grow during the night. They create these bars, and so because all the juvie feathers are growing in at once, their bars are aligned, whereas an adult feather would be misaligned. Same thing with fault bars, that's just wear along the feather. If all the feathers are equal age, they would wear at the same point. If they were coming in at different points, they would wear differently. We also have crazy cool things, like birds that spend a ton of time in the sky. They do what's called Staffelmauser molt, which means they molt blocks of their flight feathers. And then you have weird birds. I say weird because we don't ban these a lot, but falcons and parrots molt at different points in their feather. And that's how we tell age roughly for birds. How do we tell sex? So when we get easy birds, we can sex them pretty easily because they are what's called sexually dichromatic or sexually dimorphic. Scarlet tanager, and you'll see these at this time here. They don't look like this, but in the spring they look very, very distinct, very different. Right? Males are bright red, females are olive green. Cowbirds, right? Very, very different. So much so that each bird gets its own band size because of the size of their leg. Males and females of cowbirds get different band sizes. Same with eastern toads. And the reason this has evolved, again, is usually due to males using their plumage to display good immune health, using their plumage to ward off other competitors in their territory. And then the females usually have to be camouflaged against the background because they have higher parental investment. They spend more time at the nest, they spend more time with the young, and that nest and those young have to be nice and camouflaged. They can't be nice and bright and red like this, otherwise predators will be aware of their presence. Then you have all your monochromatic birds, which means males and females look alike, just like red knots. So you have ovenbirds, Carolina wrens, titmice, catbirds. They all look roughly the same. And so the way we tell these guys apart is not necessarily with the presence of feathers, but more the absence of feathers. So females, like I said, incubate young, and so they most often develop what we call brood patches. They lose feathers on their belly, and they get nice and a little blistery. And if you've ever felt a brood patch, it's nice and warm. That's the heat they give to their eggs and their young. So that's a good example of what that looks like. Males have what we call a cloacal protuberance. The cloaca is the entry, is the opening at the back of the bird. Males and females on the outside look the same, but males in the breeding season will get filled with sperm, getting ready to breed, and they will expand, and we can see that when we band these birds. Another cool thing the birds do is called plumage maturation. They say cool, but then when we get these birds in the hand, we're like, what is happening? But orioles are a good example. Orioles start out, their formative plumage in most birds looks like their adult plumage, but the formative plumage of orioles can sometimes be a little ugly. And it takes them a while to get to their definitive adult plumage. And the females, they can even go and be a little male-like with that black in the face as they get older. And one of the cool things with orioles, orchard orioles do this too, is these younger males can sometimes hover in the territory of older males and kind of poach their females. And we found this by doing genetic work on their offspring to see who's the actual father. And so this display may not be as effective as we thought of territoriality and aggression. So these younger males might be poaching females in their territory. All cool work done by banding. And then we have breeding plumages, right? If you guys go look at warblers now, most of them look different, right? Most of your charismatic warblers look very different, like magnolia warblers. That's Maggie in the fall, it's Maggie in the spring, right? The reason this has evolved is very strongly associated with migration. So because these birds travel such long distances over continents, they've evolved to have signals of their fecundity, of their health, so that when they get to their breeding grounds, they're ready to display and ready to take their territory and ready to reproduce. So all this to say, feathers are really important, and this is how we use these clues to assess their age. But again, why does this matter? Going back to our friends we met at the beginning of this story, right? Your Swainson's thrushes, your orioles, your red knots. I'll post this question again. Does it matter if we see 100 of these nice red knots or 2 of the brown juvenile red knots?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So if we're seeing less young, what does that mean for the population in 2 years? 5 years? It shrinks, right? Something is causing the young to disappear. The old ones are appearing because they're surviving through that. So if we count 500 red knots, okay, we have a good population. But if only 1% of them is young, that means we might be in trouble. So we can project the outcomes of this population using the granularity of aging these birds. So if we know that there's a ton of young, okay, the population might be fine, but if there's very few, we might need to make management decisions going down the line so that we can have more young in the future and the population stays healthy. Swainson's thrushes, right? If we get a young Swainson's thrush from Canada moving south, and it has malaria, it has maybe evidence of pesticides, it probably got it from up there because that's the only location it's been in. And if it's coming from South America, maybe there's something happening in the ecology of South America that we now are clued in on because we know the age of these birds. We know roughly where they're coming from, where they've been. White-necked jacobins, it's going to take a little more work. I can't give you all the answers yet, but knowing how males and females behave using their plumage is very important for their ecology. These guys are extremely important pollinators in their ecosystems, and knowing their territoriality, their dispersal, is very important. So that kind of knowledge and information feeds into our projects, our active research, feeds into why we do what we do. Right? Ultimately, we want to save these birds. Birds are unfortunately disappearing, and this data does everything to help us understand why and understand what we can do to stop it from happening. Right? And this is a few examples of our active research. We study everything from owls to nesting bluebirds to moths, and also taking pictures and documenting all of our data so that we have good information to work on moving in the future. And this is all supported by the collaborations of various institutions. We're not the only banding station out there. We're a pretty cool one, if I do say so myself, but we are just a blip in the network of banders in the world. And this is all supported by the USGS Bird Banding Lab. That's a federally run banding scheme here in the US, but also a connectivity of bird banders and bird researchers from North to South America. North American Banding Council, like I said, is who we are certified under, and they work with banders all over, and it's through them that we communicate all this work. And I'm rambling on a little bit, but these are the institutions that help us conserve birds, and these are the institutions that need the most support if our birds are going to get the most support. And lastly, I will end this by thanking AREI. Dr. Dave Russell is here today. He and his wife, Jill Russell, started AREI exactly to commit to the goals that I just described, and we are out here trying to save birds. And if you'd like to get involved and learn more about us, here's our information, and we'd love to see more of you around. We'd love to, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this talk and learning more about birds. And I wish you an awesome journey of learning about birds more after this. And with that, I will take any questions. Yes.
Does avian malaria and human malaria have the same source?
That's a good question.
I'm not familiar with avian malaria.
Yeah, so avian malaria and human malaria don't cross over, but they do both come from mosquitoes and similar biting flies.
So are they two different types of mosquitoes?
It can vary based on species, but it actually varies mostly on the malaria species itself. So there's a genus called Plasmodium. Plasmodium affects humans, but there's also Plasmodium species that only affect birds, and there's other genera of.
And they don't
parasites.
cross species?
They don't. They can cross bird species, but not across humans. Yeah.
I have two questions. Avian malaria, that's responsible for a lot of the extinctions on Hawaii? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
So that's non-indigenous malaria. That's malaria brought over from invasive
No,
mosquitoes.
so this isn't indigenous malaria.
Yeah, so malaria also exists in native populations, in fact, affects birds differently. So native malaria is actually, so birds are more resilient to that. They can actually survive long years with chronic conditions. Whereas if an invasive species of malaria is brought in, invasive mosquitoes are brought in, that's what really hits those Hawaiian birds, Iyengar birds really hard.
And also, the migration pattern for the snakes and stuff you showed earlier, that come like across the northern United States, is that common? Or is that, the way I heard it is like kind of there's like four major migration ways.
Highways.
You know, like kind of the Midwest,
So
East,
swans and
West.
thrush are kind of weird. That was just a weird one. The display I use is because that one hit our station specifically, that one was managed at our station. And, but most of them, I want to say, move due north, due south, and are controlled by weather patterns, but the only way we'll know more is if we tag more and see what they're doing. But there's actually two distinct populations of swans and thrushes that vary in migration. We get what's called olive-backed, which are these kind of turd colored. I say that because the genus or the family is turdidae. They're olive-back Swainson's thrushes, and they're genetically distinct from what you get in California. And their California ones are russet-backed. They're rusty colored, and they're actually shorter distance migrants than our olive-backed. Ours go all the way down to South America. Those guys stop at about Nicaragua, and they don't really touch each other, is what the current research says. Yeah. Yeah.
So the birds I'm familiar with, so I don't know about birds, but when you think about migrating birds, I'm thinking about like Canada geese in a group.
Okay.
It's like some kind of gregarious behavior. They're participating in each other's survival or whatever. Do other migrating birds like the Swainson's thrush, do they migrate in a group, or are they migrating as individuals?
They are behaviorally migrating as individuals, but a lot of these birds migrate at similar timings. And they actually, a lot of these songbirds migrate at night. And so they're actually nocturnal migrants. And they spend a lot of, it's one of the reasons why the Lights Out program exists. And so they use the stars to navigate, and these birds can, they use the stars to navigate, so that's when they fly at night. So they will fly in groups, but not necessarily as an aggregation. It's kind of more happenstance, all flying at the same time.
I have a question more about the feathers. So there's stuff like flamingos that like get their coloration from their food, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of birds are declining because there are less like caterpillars, or there's less native fruits that they are eating. Is that also like represented in any other like birds around here in their like feather color?
It can be. There's a really interesting integrate between honeysuckle berries and cardinal color. So we refer to with flamingos and cardinals. These birds are getting their coloration from their diets. We call them carotenoid pigments. And so basically, the more they eat, the more concentrated their pigments are. And like I said, cardinals are these bright red. They don't camouflage at all. Their color is for display. It's to attract mates. It's to display communication. And so one hypothesis might suggest that these cardinals traditionally have evolved to show red as a sign of health. But if younger, immature, not as healthy cardinals are eating honeysuckle berries and all these red invasive berries and are showing bright red, but aren't really as healthy, is that declining the health of the population? So that could be the case. So, yeah.
I have a question. What are all those other birds? Why do you have Jacobins and Cleveland mannequins and all that in your pictures? Why?
Yeah, because they're not here. Yeah, why do you have all this?
Why do you have all this?
So those birds, aside from being awesome birds, are birds I've encountered working in Ecuador. It's a big part of my my thesis or my dissertation work. And so we work with a partner banding station in Ecuador known as Coco del Choco. It's a little bit of the Choco rainforest in Ecuador. And one of the reasons it's so awesome is because it's incredibly biodiverse. But more relevant to us, Swainson's thrush, like I mentioned, is also found there. So I lied a little bit when I say we only catch Swainson's thrushes in Ohio. When I worked in Ecuador, we also catch Swainson's thrushes there. And so Swainson's thrushes breed in Alaska. And we can do everything to save the forests in Alaska. And that'll be great, that's awesome. But if we do nothing to save Ecuador, where they spend half their lives, they're still going to die out just the same. So it's very important for us to have that holistic perspective, and that's a big part of where we're going in our research and why we care so much about Ecuador, other than adding to our life list. Yeah.
I got two questions. One, does molting kind of align with seasonality? So, you kind of already answered that is yes, as they're migrating, they're changing their molts and stuff. But the second part of that question would be some of the birds that are closer to the equator where less seasonality changes, how does that affect molting? And do you see like local populations molting at different times because there's less seasonality?
That is exactly the
Can we give you a gold star? Those are fabulous questions, and I'm waiting to hear the answer to them.
So the reason that amuses me is that is a very, very good question. In fact, that is the question that started all of this, that started my work and everything. But, so our birds, we have very strict, probably getting less strict, but seasonalities, right? We have summer, fall, winter, spring. And migratory birds follow those seasons very well, and their life cycle is set like a clock. So almost all birds we have here breed in the summer, and then because of that timing of breeding, it's around this time of year that they start molting, because that's their molt cycle is set to when they were born. In Ecuador, or in the tropics, in West Africa, in the Caribbean, even in southern latitudes of the US, these birds aren't doing that because there's no solar clock setting them to their cycles or setting them to their breeding cycles. So birds are breeding mostly based on water availability. So if it's a good year for rain, there's more fruits, there's more food availability, and so birds are eating more, and that's signaling to them it's a good time to breed. And so at that point, you can start seeing patterns in molt, but largely all these banding stations, like Ecuador that we've worked in, all the banding stations we've communicated with, there's no pattern, and that completely skews off how they get accurate age and sex data. And that's a big part of why we're doing work down there, is to help expand the infrastructure that helps them collect that data and helps them understand what their birds are doing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, kind of extrapolate on that. Could it be? Is there any correlation between years as like they had a good season, so there was lots of available, things for them to eat, so they didn't have to struggle? Would they have? Is there any correlation between that, or like years that might have been droughted, or had a bad, food that year, or bad weather for their food?
Yeah, no, definitely. We were just there in June, and we were seeing babies, we were seeing breeding adults, we were seeing them like crazy. Of course, not all of the ones we saw, but even for our partner station there, it was a, not weird phenomenon, but an asynchronous phenomenon. Okay, it's this time of year, and it was June, but in some years it could be March, some years it could be August, right? That it depends on when the winds change, really. And that's one of the things that could be really cool about bird data in the tropics, is you can actually look at the ages of these birds, look at these proportions, and maybe extrapolate, is it a good season? Is it a good year? They can be indicator species in those habitats, how the habitats do.
Talk about WRP real quick, just why you talked about parts, but talk about WRP.
Yeah, so I didn't talk much about like how we actually coagulate our data and how we disseminate them, but here we call birds hatching year. So if a bird hatched anywhere from December 31st before, it's a hatch year, it's hatched this year. The moment it switches to January 1st, we call that a second year, because it's a second human year of the bird's life. Like we were talking about in the tropics, that doesn't really work, because our birds all kind of hatch and grow up in the fall, or summer to the fall. But in the tropics, they could be born in January, they could be born in August, they could be born in March. All true statements. And so that, what's the word? That mismatch of all the birds kind of breeding at different periods of time doesn't allow us to use the human calendar to age birds. So which is why, I'll go back here in just a second.
You asked a dangerous question.
Which is why we use the molt cycle. These happen relatively in a timely manner. This itself is kind of a biological clock. The bird's hatched, about 2 weeks afterwards, it starts growing its juvenile feathers. About 3 months later, it starts doing the formative molt. About 5 to 6 months after that, we do the pre-alternate. Most of the birds are actually this. So then once it does this, year after year, you can gauge what age it is without overlapping the human calendar onto it.
Is there any way to older birds say like know how many molts they've gone, or like processes of those molts they've gone through? Like, is there any indicators on their body?
For some species,
So I know there's like the like it's a red wax, I forget what the actual name is, but it's a bird that basically has red wax tips on its wings, and that's kind of an indicator of how old that male bird is.
Yeah, so that can be the case. So we mostly use what's called molt limits, where if it shows juvenile feathers, it's probably in its formative. But then after that, it does what's called a complete molt. Every feather is replaced. So basically from its second molt cycle onwards, it's the same age. We can't tell the difference.
Okay.
Some birds, like woodpeckers, will do this after 3 or 4 years. So up to 3 or 4 years, we can age that as, instead of just a second cycle bird, it could be second, it could be third, and then it could be what we call definitive. So we can't tell beyond that.
And some raptors also are like that, right? Because like bald eagles may take 4 years before they get to the possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, you stick a band on it when it's young, and then you know how old it is.
I think just band them all.
That's the goal. Yeah.
How do you actually go about banding? How do you have to get them safe in your hands?
So that's a good question. So the most common way of doing it at banding stations is what's called mist nets. It's these giant hair nets that we put up against basically vegetation. Honestly, sometimes I even struggle to see them. But they're basically spider webs that, as a bird flies through, it kind of cushions it into a pocket, and then we walk loops around where we place nets, and we take them out in a timely manner. And that's how we get them in the hand.
And we put modus tags on a lot of these birds. Have you guys ever grabbed the data from modus and started tracking where the birds that we tag, where they went? All the thrushes that had modus tags, did they do just totally weird things, just like that one?
Yeah, so we can actually look at modus data. It's actually open source. You can go to modus.org and you can access towers. You can go on a map and click, oh, I know this station. I can click on that, and you can see all the species that it is mapped out. I'll go back here. Yeah, so modus.org. Each of these little dots is a tower. This is publicly available again. And so you can click on it. You can click on our station right here and look at all the species that have hit our tower. Not actually hit, but the tags we put on them are these little metallic kind of discs that have a wire, and they send out radio signals with a number. Now, it's not the band number, but it has its own unique number, and it pings the tower within about 30 miles of the tower. If a bird flies through it, it will ping the tower, and it will let the database know the bird is there. And so, yeah, a lot of the thrushes that we've tagged, we can see, oh, it's generally moving in this direction, it's generally moving in that direction. Most of them kind of do this one did that. But yeah, you can actually look at bird movement. In fact, you can actually look at butterfly movement and dragonfly movement and bat movement.
Turtles.
Really cool. What's that?
There's turtles that are tagged on there. And
Oh,
stuff.
okay.
So we have
Time to migrate.
yeah. So for anybody that's interested, we have a tower at Carriage Hill and also at Inglewood. And I will put the links to those towers and the data in the email that you'll get today.
And you can even see a particular bird, click on it and see what route it took, like that image there too. So it's kind of fun to look at if this bird was at Inglewood and see its route to different countries.
You know what Modus has really done? It's shown how we know almost nothing. All of our assumptions have been shown to be largely wrong. And so, but I think the value of Modus is we always anticipated birds migrating a wave. They hit the Gulf Coast, they head up in a wave. And what we're finding is what's actually happening is there are certain geographic areas that are more important than others. If you had $1 million to spend on bird conservation in Ohio, then you would have to spend $1 million in 88 counties. Everybody got, $1 million of it. But what we're finding is birds tend to aggregate in concentration points along their migration route. So there's actually probably some areas that are considerably more valuable as stopover sites than other areas. And so from a management perspective, your dollars can be better spent concentrated in some small areas rather than across the whole state. I think that's where Modus is really coming in to help us. And Drew just ordered thousands of dollars in Modus tags today for the next days of that, because I think it's super important from a conservation perspective to be able to kind of tease some of these things out. And we've been so wrong in the past about much of it.
So send all the money to McGee. McGee Marsh. I'm just making a joke.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. We're all the freshmen. Orphans are sent to McGee.
Actually, you know what? We're right next to McGee, and they get none of our birds, and we get none of theirs.
You're kidding.
Black
We're up
Swamp
to- we're up to-
does sometimes
all
as
the
many as
time.
20,000 birds a year, usually not that many. And they're right on Lake Erie, we're south of it, and we have never gotten one of Mark's birds. And he has never gotten one of our birds. So they're doing something not north-south when they get to us. That's why this picture's been amusing us so much, because they obviously knew about Black Swamp and said, no way, I'm making a left-hand turn before I get there.
Too many people.
Going that way. But most of our birds actually go to the northeast. So they hit us and then go to New England. But that one.
What year did Modus start collecting data?
Wait, I didn't know this. 2008, I think. Yeah.
It's become much bigger in the last couple of years.
Yeah. And it used to be just spots in the U.S. And now this map doesn't show it. It's all of the U.S. There's tons of stuff down here. And there's also, on the other side of the world, Europe and Africa has their own Modus towers. It's a huge operation.
It's in 35 countries now.
Okay, 35 countries.
Yeah.
For those Modus tags you got going to be used here, or you're going to bring some down to Ecuador and
Both. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you.